Gracias a la Fundación por...
Well, thank you very much to the Foundation for having invited me to this wonderful dialogue. And I switch now to English.
I have many questions related to all the sections that you touched on. I would like to divide the conversation in three parts. First, what's going on in the US, which you already mentioned, but there are many issues to discuss. Then the transatlantic relationship and the future of European democracies. And third, since I know you've traveled frequently to Ukraine and you have strong views on what's going on there and their news today, basically touch a little bit on Ukraine. And then around 8:10, we'll start with the questions that I'm already receiving.
And then you can complain about what I just said.
Exactly. So, well, basically, in your 2020 book, The Twilight of Democracy, you explain that democracies in the 21st century, basically, they don't end with coup d'etats like in the previous century. It's a much more sophisticated way of undermining checks and balances, the rule of law, little by little, the independence of the judiciary. So you spend half of your time in DC. I already live in Washington, DC now. And when you look around, you have basically the National Guard on the streets of Washington, DC. You have a number of decisions by the Trump administration that end up in the Supreme Court, and if I'm not mistaken, out of the 17 cases that the Supreme Court has decided on, in all of them, the Supreme Court has sided with the Trump administration's view that was previously rejected by federal courts or state courts. And the list is long. Free press, many economists are here, so undermining of the independence of the Federal Reserve and other institutions. So to what extent is the US, you said it's not a dictatorship, I completely agree, but political scientists Levitsky and Wei talk about this idea of competitive authoritarianism, in which you have elections, but the elections perhaps are not free and fair because there's been a process of undermining the opposition, the free press, etc. So if you could tell us a little bit more of where do you see the US at this particular moment and how the evolution since Trump was elected in this year already has evolved or is evolving, because I also think there's been some changes.
Right, so first of all, yes, thank you. It's a real pleasure to speak with somebody who also knows Washington and Europe as well as you do. And thank you again to the Foundation for thinking to bring this my interlocutor here. So just take a step back. So the Trump administration is a coalition, and it has different members. And the Republican Party is even a wider coalition, and it also has different members. And so when we speak about them, we have to be a little nuanced. I mean, even Trump himself doesn't always agree with everybody below him. So there's some. I don't want to give you the impression that there's some very concentrated, centralized, very well organized coup d'état being planned. There's nothing like that. But there is a piece of this administration which has been influenced by the experience of the Hungarian ruling party. By the experience of the Turkish ruling party. They would never say this, but you can see some parallels with Chavez and the Venezuelan experience as well, in that they understood that that there is a way in which elected leaders, democratically elected, and I believe that Trump was democratically elected. I don't have any problem with last year's election. Democratically elected leaders can try to bend or change the system so that they don't lose again. And a lot of what you're seeing happening now in Washington, some of it is to do with that. So you see the administration trying in advance to, and this is such an American topic, to gerrymander electoral districts. So the gerrymandering, also a very old American tradition. It's named after a governor of Massachusetts from the early 19th century called Governor Gerry, who created an electoral district in Massachusetts that looked like a salamander. And that's why it's called gerrymandering. And so it's very old. But but normally the electoral districts in each state in the United States are redrawn every 10 years. And this time, the Trump administration, for the first time, we had the federal government putting pressure on state governments to change their electoral districts so as to help the Republican Party win. And that's something that hasn't happened before. We also have federal pressure on state governments to turn over their electoral rolls. So in America, elections are conducted at the state level by state governors. And they have put pressure on some states to turn their electoral rolls over to the government, presumably with the idea that the federal government would make judgments about who should be on the rolls or not. Actually, it's great to be speaking to a Spanish audience because you also understand federal and state, which some Europeans don't. So this is the backdrop. You know, at the same time, you also have the administration pushing very hard against legal tradition and against not just a little bit more than just norms to carry out policies that are also designed specifically to be beneficial to them, sometimes to the president. Take tariffs, for example. It is not clear, and this is where the Supreme Court may make a decision that surprises you. It is not clear that tariffs are legal, the president's tariffs, because in the United States, Congress has the ability to decide about tariffs and not the White House, or decide about taxes, and budgets. And Trump has taken this power to himself, and of course the way he's used tariffs has been designed to his political advantage, and even maybe personal advantage. So in Vietnam, they're now building a golf course, a Trump golf course, because they think that might be a way to get a better deal for Vietnam in tariffs. You know, we had a Swiss delegation came to Washington a few weeks ago, and some of its members brought presents for the president, including a gold bar and a Rolex desk clock. And these are expensive presents. And the Swiss, you know, they were a lot of controversy about this in Switzerland, but they did get better tariffs. So the tariffs are being used in ways that don't seem necessarily in America's interest. So, and you can go down the list. I mean, you've actually made the list already. The use of immigration and customs, not just at the borders, but inside cities. The arrests of people based on the fact that they speak Spanish, actually, or have dark-colored skin. And you know, then they're manhandled and sometimes locked up before being released if they're U.S. citizens. The use of the bringing of the National Guard into the streets of some U.S. cities, also unprecedented outside of emergencies or wartime or cases of natural disasters. So one after the other, you've seen them pushing very hard at boundaries, and in almost every case, including the use of ICE and the National Guard, you can see part of the point is to intimidate voters, to make people afraid of them, to get advantages that will help them win the next election. So it is true that what you're seeing is an attempt to create a kind of fait accompli, that that they will win. They've controlled all these, they've put pressure on the press and they put pressure on business, and they have gotten rid of all kinds of inspector generals and other people who were supposed to stop corruption inside the system, and they will use those tactics to win. So I wouldn't say that we have lost democracy yet, but this is, certainly in the last 100 years, you would have to go back to the 19th century when we had a very different kind of country to find any example of a political party or movement trying to take over the state or change the way the state works more than the Trump administration does. And also, I should say, just finally, this is what they say they're doing. So this is not me saying it. This is their self-described vision of what they're doing, and they would argue it's because only they deserve to rule the country, that they have, they represent the, they don't actually have a real majority, but that they represent real Americans. So not all Americans, but the real Americans, the important Americans, are the ones they represent. And on this basis, which is, of course, the same language Chavez used or Orban used as well.
And to that point, something that is surprising, at least when you see it from Europe, is the lack of resistance. And I would point to three particular groups that I thought, or people thought, that might resist more. One is, of course, Congress, but let's see. which has been basically, Congress has a majority by the Republican Party as well as the Senate. So this is a very particular situation. You have a very radical president with both chambers controlled by the Republicans and a Supreme Court biased towards the right. That might change in the midterms. I'll ask you about this in a minute. But basically, the Congress has been taken, or the Republican Party is dominated by Trump's view, and he's basically capable of attacking individual congressmen or women directly through his social network. The second one is companies, which I think is very interesting, and I would also like to hear your view. Both the tech companies, but also the financial sector and the crypto industry, and the idea of, as you mentioned, if the rule of law is not particularly good for a capitalist economy, how does this work? And then the Supreme Court, which we know, you already mentioned a little bit of this, but let's see what happens. The decision on tariffs will probably come in January, and it's going to be very relevant. Not because it will stop the tariffs, perhaps Trump will find a way to do tariffs in a different way, even though there might be a problem with the revenue coming from the tariffs.
And there will be a lot of lawsuits.
Exactly.
A lot, yeah.
It's going to be a mess. But basically, Congress, the Supreme Court, and the private sector, some people, a friend of mine told me it's a little bit like during the Second World War in France, the collaborationist versus the resistance. Why not more resistance from civil society?
So Congress is probably the most important, actually, of those three. I mean, I think the business community will turn and flip immediately once. I mean, I don't think they have loyalties here. They're, we're talking about large companies that have very big interests with the government. Some of them, like, Musk's companies, are subsidized by the U.S. government. Many of the tech companies have deep, complicated relations with the government, and so I think that's almost entirely explained by self-interest. I mean, it's very sad and I think very short-sighted. I mean, if you look at the history of these kinds of systems, you're absolutely right that once you lose the rule of law, then you lose, if you're a company or you're a CEO, then you can also lose in the end. I mean, the administration favors you now, but it might not 6 months from now, and you'll no longer have the courts or the system to protect you. So it's very, very short-sighted. But the most interesting one there is Congress, and Congress is, it's strange because I'm not a political reporter. I'm not in the House and Senate all the time, but I have colleagues who are, and off the record and privately, almost many. Congressmen, senators are opposed to what Trump is doing. They're concerned. They dislike his Ukraine policy. They dislike the attack on Europe. They don't think it's representative of what their constituents think. They don't like the fact that he's taken so much power. There's beginning to be even a kind of revolt against the leadership of the House right now because the House has been so weakened and taken out of politics. And the only way I can explain it is that there are two things that are new in U.S. politics. One is that we've never had before, how in Europe, in a parliamentary system, the parliamentary leader has control over his party because he can make life or death decisions about who gets to be which seat in the next elections. We've never had that before in the U.S., and we now have something like that. And the second thing is, and this is maybe hard to believe or to explain, there is an underlying level of violence now in U.S. politics that I think a lot of people in Congress, and this I've also heard, are afraid. So if you step out of line, and this applies more to Republicans than to Democrats, if you step out of line and you're a Republican who votes against the president, or you say something on social media the president doesn't like, you will be threatened. And maybe your family will be threatened. And maybe your kids will be threatened. And maybe people will stand outside your house and throw things at your window, and this has happened to enough members of Congress, or they're afraid enough of it that it's become, I think, a factor in politics in a way that it really wasn't ever before. The first person to really speak about this publicly was actually Mitt Romney, who, as you remember, was presidential candidate for the Republican Party some years ago, and recently left the Senate, was then a senator, left the Senate. And he wrote a biography was written about him, and he spoke very frankly to his biographer, again, a colleague of mine, and he said to the biographer, he described conversations that he'd had with other members of the Senate, and he'd said, well, why aren't you, this was in Trump's first term, why don't you stand up to him? He voted for impeachment, for example. Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you see he's breaking the law, why don't you say something? And they would say to him, it's all right for you, Mitt, you're very rich and you can afford security. And not everybody is so rich. He was very wealthy. He had been in business before he was in politics. And so there's that element, and the social media is a part of that too. And this is something that's not just true in the United States. I have friends who've experienced it in Mexico. You can see it in other countries. You know, the president's ability to direct anger at somebody by attacking them on social media and getting his followers to attack them on social media. I mean, this is something, again, we know happens all over the world now, but it's particularly powerful and can be very ugly in the United States, and people are afraid of it. You're also seeing now a large number of people leaving Congress because it's unpleasant to be there, and nobody wants that kind of pressure on themselves or their families. I mean, with your final point about the courts, I think that's I still am leaving that open. We'll see what the Supreme Court does. I still don't think we've had a case that is, really definitive, in which they really definitively backed the president in something that most people think is illegal. But we'll see what happens. One of the strange things about, well, it's not strange, but the definition of what it means to be a conservative judge in the United States means that you are fanatically devoted to the Constitution. They're originalists, and they believe in the letter, the words of the Constitution. So maybe that has to affect them at some point. But we'll see.
And we will see. You are going to have elections. The midterms are in November. And to a certain extent, there's this perception, I don't know if you share it, but when you talk to people in DC, that the first 6, 7, 8 months have been really a shock. But recently, there are a number of things that are changing. So first, you have the so-called affordability crisis, people concerned with the rising inflation that, as most economists would predict, have something to do with the tariffs, of course. Inflation is at 3%, the Fed target is 2%, and it's probably going to go up a little bit more. That's why, in part, Trump would like to have someone at the Fed that is going to reduce interest rates instead of raising them. We'll see. That's going to happen probably in May. Then they talk about the K-shaped economy, because there's like a K, some part of the economy, everything related to tech, data centers, investment, crypto.
AI.
It's going great, AI. And then small and medium companies, small businesses, and the base of the MAGA movement is not doing great. Unemployment, there were data just coming out today with the unemployment rate hitting 4.5, which is very low, but it's going up from where it was. Then you also have the victories of the Democrats in Virginia, New Jersey, at the federal level. And then you also have this perception that there's some divisions within the MAGA coalition. That Trump has been able to put together a very complex coalition, and some elements emerge. Majorly Taylor Greene, maybe you were referring to her in your last answer, a very, very much pro-Trump member of Congress that just resigned because of the Epstein files. So to what extent do you think some things are being more complicated now for the administration, and to what extent this could mean that the Democrats can get control of the House in the midterms, and what would be the implications of that for the next 3 years? So
yes, I mean, so to be honest, I expected this Trump administration to be very radical, but not everybody did. And I expected it because of the events of January the 6th, and because of the people who were attracted to Trump after 2021 because of that. In other words, his previous government wasn't filled with people who had radical ideas about the United States or radical distrust of American democracy, and really everybody in America who had different reasons to feel this kind of distrust was attracted to him after January the 6th. And so he had a very different group of people around him this time than he did last time. And I knew that would happen, but I think other people were surprised by it. So there was a kind of shock in the beginning when they did things that seemed out of line. I mean, they were we haven't even talked about, firing of civil servants, replacing them with loyalists, which is something that happens in every democracy that declines. As I mentioned in my few remarks, of this kind of dismantling of whole departments of the government that, which also was probably illegal, but once you've dismantled USAID and it doesn't exist anymore, even if a court found that was illegal, then what do? It's gone. I mean, the people are all fired and the programs are canceled. And so some of that was, people were very shocked and they were surprised and they were reeling. And I think you're right that there has now been, people understand that a lot of this agenda is not popular. I would even say the attacks on Europe are not popular. There's no mass dislike of Europeans in America. The Trump administration's apparent favoring of Russia over Ukraine, which sort of goes back and forth, is also unpopular. I mean, there's a whole list of things that are unpopular. Plus, as you say, the tariffs people are blaming the tariffs directly for rise in prices. People are blaming the sort of economic chaos around Trump and the feeling and appearance of chaos for this sense of instability that people have. So yeah, I think you have now had a shift. I mean, the question then is, can the Trump administration's attempt to change or alter the playing field in advance of the midterms, can that work anyway? Or will there be a Democratic victory? I mean, I think a Democratic victory next year would be pretty transformational. And you would then see a lot of big shifts. You would see a lot of the president's allies drifting away. I'll say one other thing. There is a coalition of people who are inside who supported Trump, and they did have very different reasons. I mean, I think there are roughly three groups. One of them are the so-called Christian nationalists who have been in American politics for 100 years. They've been around for a long time, but they've never had power outside of the state level. They've never had federal power, and they're people who believe that the United States should not be a secular state, but it should be a Christian state, which is not popular, I should say. I mean, that's not a popular view, but that's their view. There's also, you could call them tech authoritarians, or you could be ruder if you wanted. And these are people from Silicon Valley who came to the conclusion some years ago that democracy was in their way and that what they wanted was direct power. They wanted to meld the power of their companies with the power of the U.S. government and use the U.S. government as part of their business plan. And some of them have been again, this is not me saying my opinion, this is what they say. So Peter Thiel, whose name I'm sure most of you know, has openly said he doesn't like democracy, he doesn't think it works, and he doesn't think the United States should be a democracy anymore. So it's not a figment of anybody's imagination. This is how they speak. I think they were attracted to Trump, again, not for his, because he understands them or he cares particularly about their projects, but again, because of his radicalism and his. Then there's a third group, sort of, who you could call maybe traditional MAGA, who are whose language I think you saw in that national security document, who are attached to a kind of ethnic definition of the United States. So the United States as a native white country descended from, I'm not sure actually who they think they're descended from, because there are a lot of white people in America descended, Actually, my family came to the United States in the 1820s, so they've been there just as long as J.D. Vance's family, and they were Jews from Alsace-Lorraine, so I don't know whether we count or not, but anyway. It's not that well defined, it's not what they don't explain it that well, but they have an idea that the United States has been, overwhelmed by immigrants and so on. So that's their language. And those three groups have a lot of differences. So the tech people think immigration is good, especially at the high level. They want to have engineers from India come to the United States. And Trump has sympathy with that as well. Trump has always hired immigrants for his businesses, including possibly illegal ones. And then the other two, the third group doesn't want any immigration. Anyway, and you can see how how they've clashed. They clash over issues of race, over anti-Semitism, over economic policy. They have very different views. And yeah, you could see over the next year that group. And this is, I should say, once again, these are the ideologues. These are the people who are in the administration. They don't represent the entire Republican Party, many of which still contains George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan Republicans.
But they're very silent, I guess.
At the moment, they're more silent, but they're still there.
Yeah.
I don't think it represents all Trump voters.
Okay, but what it's clear is that those Republicans didn't write the national security strategy.
No, they didn't.
So let me turn to Europe and the national security strategy. This is a very interesting document that I recommend you all read. It's very short.
Very short.
It's shorter than others. And you just wrote a piece on it in which you call it a suicidal note. But before you explain to us why, let me just read, and I quote what it says about Europe. The European Union economic decline, which is problematic according to the strategy, is eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure, which has been the thing that has touched every single European, right? The idea that European civilization, whatever that means, might disappear in 20 years. The largest issue facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty and sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strict censorship of free speech and suppression of political opposition, cratering birth rates and loss of national identities and self-confidence. So this is what the strategy says. And then Elon Musk has even said that the European Union has to be dismantled. So, as Europeans, what should we make of this strategy? It has to be taken seriously. To what extent? Has Trump read it? That's another question.
So I doubt he's read it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, others, people who've worked with him, he doesn't read much. He doesn't like to read, and he has other qualities, but that's not one thing he likes to do. And again, I don't think even the strategy represents the whole administration or the whole State Department or the whole national security apparatus at all. But it does have to be taken seriously because as somebody in Washington explained to me last week, once the strategy is written, then there are decisions lower down that can be taken by ordinary bureaucrats or by diplomats without having to ask the president, if you see what I mean. I mean, this sets the strategy, and then it's meant to direct the national security apparatus in a particular direction. I mean, you don't want to take it too seriously because, people write things and no one pays attention to it all the time in Washington. I'm sure that never happens in Madrid, but I wouldn't overdo it. And we know who wrote it, and it's a particular faction inside the administration and so on, as I've said. But there is well, let me say first two things. One is, why do I think it's a suicide note? If you read the whole strategy, I mean, actually, the part about Europe is very short. What's really most strange about it is that it doesn't identify any enemies or threats to the United States. So North Korea is not mentioned. Iran is dismissed. Islamic terrorism, hardly mentioned, doesn't really appear. China is described as a kind of trading rival, but not, the fact that China hacks into U.S. infrastructure, and the fact that China collects data on Americans, and the fact that China is competing with American business and seeking to squeeze out Western companies from Africa and Latin America. This is doesn't really figure. Russia appears only as a threat to Europe. This is not really our problem, it's Europe's problem. Even though, again, literally last week there was an announcement of an investigation, Justice Department investigation, American investigation into Russian hacking of American infrastructure. So this is the Russians have an ongoing program of doing influence campaigns, hacking campaigns inside the United States. And as you know, they have campaigns of sabotage and influence operations all over Europe as well. But Russia doesn't really appear. And so it's almost as if the United States, lives on its island and it has no real enemies. And the only problem for it is European civilizational decline. And so the only thing that we really need to think about is how to intervene in Europe to break up the European Union. And you know, if you think about it, it's a very strange document for your national security strategy. And so what are the CIA and the FBI and the Pentagon and the other US agencies who do strategy or who do counterintelligence, what are they supposed to make of this? We don't have enemies anymore. We should just do border control. You know, we don't have to worry about the rest of the world where, you know, we just have to worry about our trade imbalances. And it's in that sense, it's the country it's most dangerous for is the United States. You know, if you can't, you know, and I should say, the U.S. has made a lot of mistakes before. You know, there was, of course, inside the U.S. administration, you know, 2 decades ago, there were people who really believed Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and that this was a great threat to the United States, and they made a terrible mistake on those grounds. You know, you can go back to the Cold War and you can find moments when the CIA completely overestimated the Soviet Union and its power, and they misunderstood, they didn't see the decline when it was happening. So, of course, you know, they've made mistakes. But this is a really large mistake. I mean, this is a mistake of not seeing any threats to America at all, and therefore being totally unprepared, and that's why I described it as a suicide note. I mean, the attitude to Europe, I should say, also, this complicated Trump coalition that I was talking about also helps to explain the European story, part of the story. One is, again, these kind of white supremacists, white nationalists who are obsessed with immigration. Really what they're talking about is their fears about the United States, because actually it's the United States that is most likely to become a minority country much faster than any European country. And I looked at all the statistics before I wrote about it. There's no European country that's heading in that direction anytime soon.
You mean a minority of what?
Yeah, in which there would be what they call a minority of non-Europeans. There's no country that's, despite the far right language, it's not happening anywhere. The only place it could happen is in the U.S. And so, you know, you can see that element in the strategy. And then there's, of course, what I think is the real issue for people around Trump, which is the fact that the one institution on the planet that is still capable of regulating large American companies, especially tech companies, is the European Union. Nobody else can do it. Nobody else has the power. The only body that can do it is Europe. And so they've decided that it's in their interest to dismantle Europe, and I think that's mostly the explanation. I mean, I think the stuff about civilization and erasure, and I think that's just window dressing, and it's really about that.
No, I can share that view because last week I was at an event with the USTR, so the trade minister of the Trump administration, basically saying that European taxes on digital taxes are basically unacceptable and the US would not accept it, which is not something you would do, you know, if you're in Europe talking about the rules and the laws in the US. But going specifically to your point, the strategy, it's not written so clearly, even though there's this idea that there was a larger, longer document that has not been circulated. We don't know if it's true or not. That also talks about other things. But it specifically says that the US is no longer in the business of promoting democracy abroad. Mm-hmm. So it's not in the business of regime change anymore, except in European countries, in which the idea is that the US, and this is not new, and actually some people have been telling me this last week, why are you so surprised? We've knew this since J.D. Vance spoke in Munich about, you know, the enemy within in Europe that you mentioned in your remarks. But to what extent is the US capable of influencing European elections in practice? The far-right Alternative for Deutschland or, you know, other countries?
So I don't know that they can do it, but they will try. And in some places it's already backfired. In Canada, the Trump administration's support for the Canadian Conservatives flipped the election against the Canadian Conservatives.
Mm-hmm. And Mark Carney.
And something similar happened in Australia. So, elections are tricky, and even the Russians have tried to influence elections, and that sometimes works and sometimes it backfires. But they might try. So we had actually an election in Poland, a presidential election some months ago, and the Trump administration did intervene. They received one of the presidential candidates from the far right. They received him in Washington. They also staged, and the people close to the administration staged a CPAC event a few days before the final round of the election. They brought people from the Trump administration there. I don't know how, I mean, it's always hard to measure, why does anybody vote for anything? You don't ever really know. But, as a way of giving more credibility to this candidate, maybe it helped. And it was a very close election of the difference of a few 100,000 votes. Maybe, it was less than 1%. So in a very, very close election, maybe that swayed some people, I don't know.
And would you argue the EU has to defend itself by, for example, blocking Twitter or X, or that would backfire here, perhaps?
So I don't have I'm not going to make a recommendation to the EU, but, so far the EU's efforts to regulate Twitter, the thing that was the regulation that was passed, the fine that was announced a few weeks ago, and that Elon Musk has objected to, is about making Twitter more transparent. Mm-hmm. So one of the strange phenomenon of the current moment is that we have people shouting about free speech on platforms that are not free. And so one of the strange things about social media is you go on it, you write your thing, you get some people responding to it, and you feel like you're engaged in an open conversation and you have free speech, right? But actually, who decides who reads your comments? How many people see it? How many people are able to respond to it? Who is making this decision about what travels the farthest and the fastest? It's not you. Mm-hmm. That decision is made by algorithms that are written in California. And the algorithms depends a little bit, all the platforms are different, but, and X is special because I think the Twitter X platform is now written to promote the far right. I mean, it's pretty clear if you're on it or you spend any time there, you can see it. Most of the rest of them, I think Meta, the main idea is to keep people online as much as possible and to make people look at as many advertisements as possible. And the algorithm has understood that the best way to do that is to make people angry and outraged because then they're more likely to stay online. And also the social media companies benefit from the creation of these kind of identity groups or tribes because then they can identify people and sell them or advertise things that for that group. And so I will not say that all modern political polarization is thanks to the internet, but it certainly helps. And so thinking about social media, not about censoring it, but thinking about how to make the algorithms more open and more transparent, how to make access to them more equitable, maybe how to regulate the algorithms themselves. This is the way, and this is, of course, what people in the US wanted to do, and we're talking about during the Biden administration, but they didn't get around to it because they just didn't.
Yeah.
But there has been a large academic conversation about how you could improve the internet so that it was actually a forum for free speech and so that it was a real public square rather than something that's manipulated and controlled by rich people for their own benefit. I still hope that the conversation in Europe will be better and we will get to those kinds of changes here, even if we can't do it in America right now.
Yeah, and by the way, the fine on X was about verification of who are you when you're speaking online, not about any of the claims about free speech. But last question about this.
No, but they use this lie about free speech as a way of, making their argument. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
So before turning to Ukraine briefly, and then I have thousands of questions, the issue that seems to unite the extreme right parties, and that is electorally more appealing, is basically the issue of immigration. And if you look at Trump's approval ratings, they are going down fast, except for immigration. A little bit for immigration as well, but not so fast. And basically, we have in Europe an aging population. We need migration. On the other hand, there's this tension. There's this the extreme right takes advantage of this element, but it's an issue. So to what extent, what are your thoughts on how to think about immigration? Also thinking in terms of Eastern Europe as well.
So there are two kinds of immigration issues. One of them is a real issue. Like there's a real issue of people who come to Europe and are integrated or not integrated, and there are policies to be had about how many should be let in and whether we should continue with the asylum policies that were written in the 20th century, which I think probably can't. There is a real issue of how many people a given population can absorb without there being a backlash. We can see there is a limit, and all of those issues, I feel that there should be a way to discuss them reasonably between reasonable people. From the center left, to the center right, to whatever, even on extremes, you should be able to sit down in a room and say, how much immigration can we take? Are the asylum laws and the border laws, up to date for this century? We didn't have mass movements of people when they were written 50 years ago. What criteria should we accept people or not? I mean, all of that seems to me perfectly legitimate, open conversation. I mean, I was saying to somebody else just before this, Poland had a problem it was a real problem with real immigration on their eastern border. The Belarusian government was importing people from all over the world, actually, from Kurdistan and Afghanistan, bringing them to the border and pushing them over the border. It was actually, I saw some of this myself. I went it's very, very strange to be in a cold Polish forest, and there's a family from Kurdistan sitting on the ground. How did they get there? What kind of a strange world do we live in that has happened? And the Poles have said, no, we just can't have anybody crossing the border there. They built a fence, and you cannot claim asylum by crossing into Poland illegally on that border. And it seems to me that there was nothing undemocratic about that decision. It was popular. It was taken by a democratically elected center government, the current government. And that seems to me, you can have all kinds of conversations that seem legitimate. There's a second conversation about immigration, which is not about real immigration. It's about creating cultural fear and making people afraid, exactly the language of this national security stranger, that we will be drowned by foreigners, or our culture will disappear, or our language will disappear. And some of this is not really about immigration. It's about, in the globalized world, actually, you don't have that in this country. Will people go on to speak Spanish? Yes, they will. So you don't, but if you're Bulgarian, will people speak Bulgarian, and will people read Bulgarian poetry in 100 years, is how Ivan Krastev put it. Will our nation survive? And so there's some anxiety about that feeds into this immigration debate, and there are kind of political entrepreneurs who've learned how to play on this fear and make it greater than it is. And some of it is racist, and some of it's not, but it seems to me that conversation is something that it's not useful, it's not productive, it doesn't create better politics, it doesn't create good solutions, it makes people angry. And the more we can not have that be part of politics, the better. And there's also, using immigration or cultural fear or other phobias as a way of obtaining political power. I mean, it's one of the things Trump did during the election. It just doesn't make for good politics, and you don't elect good people that way. So, so I would separate those two conversations. There's a absolutely legitimate one. Every country is allowed to control immigration as it wishes. Every country is allowed to argue that the EU's policies should be different. I think that's completely fair and legitimate, but that's separate from this creation of hysteria.
Thank you. Let's move in 7-8 minutes a little bit to Eastern Europe and Ukraine and NATO. You said you are a citizen of NATO.
I'm a citizen of NATO.
I like that. In Ukraine, well, I won't go into details. Basically, we had Trump wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. That's clear. He wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and
it's going to be hard.
And it's going to be hard. But yeah, this is one of his.
How much time have you spent in Norway?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. And then let's see what happens in Venezuela. But anyway, there's a peace plan which has a number of points with an ultimatum. This peace plan has started being negotiated between Trump and Putin. I heard Zelensky this morning was officially speaking about the second round of this plan, which basically would be a division of Ukraine with some security guarantees that are unclear. To what extent this could work and we could see an end of this terrible war that's been going on for 3 years now?
So the problem with the peace plan as it's currently conceived is that really the war is only over, like really over forever, not over for 1 year or 6 months or 2 years. The war is only over when the Russians understand that they cannot win and that Ukraine will not be part of Russia. When they come to that understanding. This is a colonial war. You know, it's like the French war in Algeria. You know, there was simply a moment when the French no longer wanted Algeria to be French, and they gave up. And that caused, if those of you who remember French history, there was a kind of almost coup d'etat in Paris, and somebody tried to assassinate Charles de Gaulle, and it was a very big moment for France, but Algeria is not France. They made this decision. And the Russians have not yet reached that moment when they understand that their former colony is not them. And so until we are there, then it's very hard to talk about a long-term peace. And the Ukrainians understand this very well. And that's why for them, you know, even if there could be a ceasefire negotiation, even if there could be an end to the fighting, which I think right now they would accept on the current lines, a ceasefire, this is why they keep talking about security guarantees, because a ceasefire that lasts for a brief period of time and a ceasefire without security guarantees means that Ukraine is not a viable state. So who will invest in Ukraine if the Russians are going to invade again next week? You know, who wants to live in Ukraine? You know, will young men stay in Ukraine if there's going to be a war soon? You know, it's a recipe for a kind of post-war catastrophe. And this is why that question, they keep returning to it over and over and over again. I am not sure that Trump's envoys understand this. Nor do I think they understand the Russians very well. And here we get once again into this strangeness of this current administration. So one of the things that they are clearly also negotiating along with peace in Ukraine is they are also negotiating American-Russian business deals. And this has been, again, extensively reported. It's been reported by the Financial Times. It's been reported by the Wall Street Journal. There are specific companies, some of them have connections to the Trump family or to Trump's entourage, who think that they will have a special deal with Russia when the war is over. And so then you have to ask, you know, what are the motives of the negotiators? And do they understand that? I mean, it may be that the U.S. and Ukraine come to present some plan to Putin and he turns it down, and then we're kind of back to square one, I'm not sure. But the problem with the way the negotiations have been run so far, you know, with the Americans talking to the to the Russians about deals, is that it doesn't give, you know, it's encouraging Putin to believe there will be a second chance. So he's not seeing united democratic world that he had before. He's not seeing, you know, the U.S. united with Europe. You know, he's seeing a chance to break apart America and Europe, and he's not seeing a reason to end the war. And that's the fundamental problem with the negotiations. I mean, so most of the Ukrainians I know don't think there will be any peace before the spring. Some of them think that the Russians are not going to be able to sustain this level of casualties indefinitely. So I don't know if this is well known in Spain, but the Russians are now losing 1,000 people a day, and that's people killed and wounded. And I was just saying this, you know, the United States, over the whole long period of the Vietnam War, lost about 60,000 people, 65,000 people. And this was a national trauma that we worried about for generations. We made movies about it. You know, Vietnam veterans were figures in the popular imagination for a long time. The Russians are now losing the equivalent of the entire Vietnam War every 2 months. And right now they're paying people a lot to go and fight, and they're still able to continue recruiting people, but there has to be an end. They don't have an indefinite number of people. They don't have an indefinite number of people even to work in their factories. I mean, they have, you talk about a birth rate crisis, that they have one, a very strong one. I mean, almost, they also have, by the way, a lot of immigrants from outside of Europe. It's a lot of mythology about Russia as some kind of white Christian state is also untrue. So they can't do it indefinitely. So at some point, they have to reach the conclusion that Ukraine will not be Russia. And once they reach that conclusion, then the war can end, and then we can have an argument about where the border should be.
But then that means that since the Trump administration is unlikely to give another supplemental and give more money to
the Trump administration,
you need Europe.
Right now, the Ukrainians haven't had any American money since the beginning of the year, or weapons. A little bit. Sorry, there were some from the previous administration, but there are not any new weapons. Right now, the Ukrainians are fighting with European weapons and European money, as well as their own. And this is also not, I think, that well known, their own very extensive weapons industry. So they now make, many thousands, tens of thousands, more actually. They made 2 million drones last year, and they're going to make 4 million drones this year. This is now a huge industry.
So to what extent can then the European Union use, Trump as an external federalizer and the Russian threat as a way to, get its act together, integrate deeper, take more seriously this concept of strategic autonomy, avoid the risk of being, the playground instead of a player in international politics, given that some of the political parties on the extreme right want to basically...
Well, this is the biggest danger, actually, in Europe. I mean, the biggest danger is that, a coalition of far-right, pro-Russian far-right parties, either in one country or another or inside the European Union, are able to block European support for Ukraine. So remember, this is a security danger that goes beyond Ukraine. So there is now an extensive Russian sabotage operation across Europe. The Germans think the sabotage is being very clearly directed at logistics. The logistics that the Germans and the Poles and others would need to move if they ever were at war with Russia. That they feel this is a kind of advance operation. So the Russians' strategy is that, there's a Lenin quote that I don't remember exactly, but it's something like, you keep pushing with the bayonet until you hit steel. So their national policy is we keep going until someone stops us. And for Europe to be unprepared, especially thanks to, internal politics would be really tragic.
Let's move in this last 15 minutes to some of the questions. Here I'm going to try to learn from Vicente, who's also has always been a great moderator and knows how to read at the same time he asks. There are a number of questions about Spanish politics, and I'm just not going to ask
You know more about Spanish politics than I do.
Because basically, it's going to be better, I think, but I know
I'm pro-Spain.
Yeah, and I know you've written a number of articles over the years about Spain, so people can read them.
I wrote, it was some years ago, I wrote about Spain. But.
So there's one very specific question, but by 2 or 3 people, short answer probably. Is Trump going to be able to run in 2028?
No.
Good. No need of...
I don't think so. I mean...
No change in the Constitution and...
I don't want to be...
Okay,
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think he wants to. I think he says it to irritate people.
Yeah, I agree. So there's a question that comes in different forms about the underlying reasons that are behind the rise of these anti-system parties, both left and right. People have talked about economic issues, cultural explanations. What's your view? What is really driving this move towards the extreme route in this case, but in general, away from the center?
So I think that we live in a time of enormous change and uncertainty, so much so that we haven't noticed it. The way that we work, the way that we relate to each other, the way we have political conversations and argument. I mean, we just were talking about social media a minute ago, has been transformed completely in the last decade or 2 decades. There's huge economic change, there's demographic change, there's social change. We have absorbed this enormous transition and transformation. And if you look back at history, almost every time when you find a society where this happens, you have a counter-reaction. You look at Germany had a kind of industrial revolution at the end of the 19th century, and the rise of the German far right, is the origins of the ideas are there. And we're living through this moment of huge change, and I think that it's a moment when people want clarity and certainty, and the noise of argument and ideas can become too much for many people. Actually, it's almost too much for me. I mean, I have days when I can't open my phone because I just don't want to, I don't want to hear it anymore. And I understand that, and so the idea that there are simple solutions or there are slogans or what we need is to knock down the whole system and, just have one party in charge, I think that's very appealing right now to a lot of people. And again, historically, if you look at authoritarianism and you look at when it emerges, it comes after a civil war, or it comes after a moment of transition, or it comes after a military loss. Or you can look at history, and it's almost always in this moment when people want some kind of sense of security and certainty and stability. And I think that's why this authoritarian narrative that is partly created by the autocratic world and partly created by us, actually it's a sort of joint product, is appealing right now. That's my explanation, which is more cultural than economic. But I understand that there are, especially in America, these very profound, you talked about the K economy, these profound economic differences, and that people living such radically different lives does create a sense of deep unfairness and questioning of whether, what does our political system work? So I think it's primarily this cultural shift, but there's an economic element to that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And surprising that there's no discussion about redistribution in the US, which is really shocking for a European. That's not on the public debate. Another question is about who's really calling the shots within the Trump administration. So is it Trump? Is it someone else? Are these different groups you mentioned? And to what extent, after Trump, this could be continued by the Republican Party?
So I think Trump is very important. He gives the tone, and he doesn't have a political strategy really or a philosophy, but he has these very strong instincts. For example, he likes tariffs. He has always liked tariffs. He's been talking about tariffs for 30 years, and he's surrounded by people, some of whom think tariffs are bad and know that there was an interview today with his chief of staff, who I think is anti-tariff. People, there are free market economists in the Trump administration who understand that tariffs will create higher prices. But it's his instinct, it's his personal way of understanding the world, and so that's I think it's absolutely his policy. So it's not that he's a puppet or other people are in charge, but he doesn't do the. He'll do the big idea, but he doesn't necessarily do the, is he following day to day what is the State Department's policy towards the European far right? I doubt it. Is he following in great detail the Ukraine-Russia negotiations? Probably not. But that doesn't mean he doesn't matter. So he has a role, and people are around him want to do what he says, and when he has very strong views about things, they follow them. Beyond that, it depends on the issue, and it's clear there are some clashes inside the administration, and there have been big clashes over immigration, for example, over this question of visas for
H-1 visas.
These are these visas for very highly educated, experienced people
that now cost $100,000.
Then the tech, the Silicon Valley wants them, and other people don't want them, and so there have been some clashes. I think there were clashes about tariffs. I think there have been some clashes about foreign policy. There have been some clashes about Ukraine. So there's there are different. There are differences in every administration. It has to be said. The difference, I think, with this administration is in the past, there was always a policy process, and sometimes that would be very tedious. There would be, You would have meetings at the level of deputy assistant secretary, and they would come to a conclusion, and then there would be a meeting of the assistant secretaries, and then the deputies, and then the secretaries, and then it would get to the president. And there was we called it in Washington the policy process. And sometimes maybe it was too long and boring, and maybe they didn't need to do it. But Trump has abolished that completely. There is no policy process. There's very little input from the State Department, for example, from experts in Russia into the negotiations. They're not there, they're not consulted. And that's true in all kinds of other areas as well. And so policy becomes very personalized. Kushner gets brought in, the president's son-in-law, to do the Middle East, and other friends of his get to make decisions about other pieces of policy, and he turns to people that he knows or his business contacts or so on to make decisions. And that's why it can feel chaotic, because because there isn't an overall philosophy. Instead, it's more whimsical.
And my understanding is that he makes the final decisions on most of the things.
Probably.
Which leads to the next question. There are some or many Latin Americans in the audience, and the national security strategy states clearly that Latin America is the U.S. backyard. It's what they call the corollary to the Monroe, the Trumpian corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
We don't know what that means yet.
Exactly. So the question is interesting. So there's some people probably in some of these Latin American countries, I'm thinking about Venezuela, that might think that's a great idea to have a regime change. On the other hand, to what extent should countries be concerned about this idea that the U.S. can do whatever it wants in Latin America?
So I think a lot of people are concerned about this idea that the U.S. can do whatever it wants. Venezuela is a special case. Some of you know I've written about Venezuela. I've been to Venezuela. I think the Maduro regime is one of the ugliest. Actually, in the world, it's it's maybe not the harshest regime, but it's a place of really lost possibility. This was the richest country in South America, and now it's the poorest. It produces more refugees than Ukraine and Gaza, and there isn't even a war there. They have malnutrition in a country that should be, rich and wealthy, and they've systematically destroyed institutions and so on. And so, I was, pleased that when Maria Corina Machado won the Nobel Prize, I interviewed her actually earlier this year and reran the interview when she won. My fear is that the Trump administration repeatedly says that its main goal is not democracy. They don't even talk about regime change. And I'm not quite sure what exactly is their plan in Venezuela. And I don't know how they intend to use the military exactly to pressure Maduro, and there are some things that are worrying. Is part of the reason they want to do it domestic? So they want to have a war, so they can say they're at war. That gives them another opportunity to say it's an emergency and we need to do things outside of the law, which they've tried to do previously. Is it because they're interested in Venezuelan oil? Is it because I don't know exactly what is their goal. The best outcome would be the return to Venezuela of the legitimately elected government, the legitimate president, who's Edmundo Gonzalez. But I haven't heard the administration say that as their preferred outcome. And so I worry about Venezuela. I would just put it like that. And as for the rest of the continent, I fear that the Trump administration will find that there are some very large countries, Brazil, for example, that don't want the U.S. to dictate policy to them. You could see that as looking at Latin America as America's backyard and as a place that we can dominate and bully. I'm not sure that's going to be successful everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And last question in 4 minutes, which I think is very profound, and it goes something like this. Based on history, what mistakes do liberal democracies do when trying to confront the extreme right that they should avoid this time?
Liberal democracies very often fragment because the coalition that you need to fight dictatorship is different from ordinary politics. So you're used to being on the center right, and so you really hate the center left. or you're used to doing politics in a normal way, you often come to a moment when actually the rules have changed and the center right and the center left need to work together. They disagree about everything. They disagree about taxes. They disagree about abortion. I don't know about everything, but they need to work together to protect liberal democracy. And for a lot of people, that's too hard. And so the mistake is this fragmentation and not seeing the moment when politics have changed.
Well, on that note, let's see if it's possible to revive liberal democracies.
It's possible. It can happen. It's happened before. Absolutely.
So, and thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you, everyone.